Tonight on Free Minds TV, a lot of you out there didn't think that we really could name one positive aspect to every form of government, so we're going to try to do that. We'll also be talking about how, well, apparently many Americans are not comfortable with the idea of actually cutting government spending, even though you say you don't want bigger deficits. That plus a whole lot more coming up tonight on Free Minds TV.
And welcome to episode 184 of Free Minds TV, where we challenge you, the viewer, to think outside the box. As always, it is Toby here with you.
And Nick.
And Nick, I wanted to start off with talking about a bit of backlash we got from our show last week. Last week we were talking about a poll coming from Afghanistan that had some pretty revealing statistics. One of them, the reason we started talking about it, was the fact that over 90% of Afghans have never even heard of September 11th attacks in New York. And
that was one of the most striking statistics,
right?
Probably for an American audience.
Sure. And then we went on to reveal some other statistics in there, and one of them was like some 40-something% of the Afghans out there couldn't name one positive form of democracy.
One positive aspect.
One positive aspect of democracy, despite the fact that that's what's going to save us all from terrorism, right?
Well, that's the U.S. government's position.
Sure, that's the position. And we were saying, well, that's pretty sad of the U.S. to be trying to implement this if they're not doing the public campaign on the other side. It's just, of course, not going to work. And we got a lot of comments, a lot of viewers out there were very upset with us because we are typically a small government show talking about things from a liberty-oriented perspective, a smaller government. We're libertarians here for the most part, although we do stray around from here to here. But we believe in a small government for the most part, principled small government. And a lot of our viewers were upset that we were, propping up this idea of democracy where it's two wolves and a sheep deciding what to have for dinner, essentially. And a lot of them said, well, I can't name one positive form of democracy either. Smaller government or no government's much better, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And to those people out there, I'd just like to say, well, if you honestly can't think of one positive aspect of democracy, or any form of government for that matter, well, you're not trying very hard and you're not thinking. I mean, I'm not saying that the bad aren't going to outweigh all that, but if you can't honestly think about it and name one positive aspect of pretty much all the forms of government, short of strong arm groups, but those still work for the strongmen at least. If you honestly can't think of one positive aspect, well, you're not thinking. Let's think critically about this. Let's be honest about it. Let's not just say, oh, every aspect of democracy is bad. That's final. I'm an anarchist and that's that. Well, no, because then you're not being honest with yourself. You're not thinking about the issues, and no one's going to listen to you. There are very many positive aspects of democracy. I think a lot of those are outweighed by a lot of bad aspects as well. Two wolves and a sheep deciding what they're going to have for dinner. Sheep's going to lose, he's going to get eaten. But there are positive aspects as well, such as withholding all these other worse forms of government, giving some people a voice. And I'm not advocating for that necessarily. What I am saying is that if you're honestly saying there's no positive forms about communism even, about totalitarian governments, well, you're lying to yourself. Yeah. Or you're just not thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I prefer that form of government be democratic. If you're going to have a government around, I prefer that government be very small and very limited. I think what a lot of libertarians and anarchists dislike about democracy is that people who advocate pure democracy or sort of worship at the altar of democracy as if that form of government is somehow sanctified and holy, they kind of forget that an unlimited democracy isn't that much different than a dictatorship, except that more people get to act as dictators. But the end result is about the same. But you can name positive aspects to just about any form of government. A lot of people in the Soviet Union pointed out one criticism of the new government in Russia right after the period when the Soviet Union had fallen, which was that they didn't suppress crime very well. Even Stalin's government produced some kind of good, and it depends on your value system. Obviously, I don't think there are very many reasonable people out there who are going to think that Joseph Stalin was a good guy or that you want to have a Stalinist form of government, unless you're a psychopath. But he was very good at suppressing crime.
Sure. And I mean, it just goes across the board like that. Yes, the bad will often outweigh the good.
Yeah, he killed 30 million people.
Right.
So
Government is
killed a lot more than
forced.
criminals. But.
Government is forced. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. It's the bigger gang deciding, suppressing the smaller gangs out there. Personally, and I think Nick's view on this is the same, that we do require some form of government to make sure the biggest gang doesn't get up there. The current government, as far as our opinion on Free Minds TV, is it is way too big. We would cut it by 90% and then talk about how to cut it more. But that doesn't mean that you can't name a couple positive aspects of what we currently have. So I just want people to keep in mind out there when they're thinking about this, when they're talking to other people, think critically, don't jump to conclusions, and don't do this all or nothing thinking, because you're going to turn other people off, and well, you're just not being honest with yourself, and eventually you'll burn out. So just wanted to throw that out there before we get into this. And I'm sure we are upsetting those people, those same people out there, because when you have that one set mind thinking where you're not honestly weighing the pros and cons of different things and you're like, all good, all bad, well, then you probably quit listening to what we started saying at the very beginning.
Principles are good, but I think if you try to, if you basically become an ideologue and you act like everybody should just overnight adopt your principles for no apparent reason, I think sometimes you can forget how to talk to people who don't already think the same way that you do. If you want to make the world a more free place, if you are an anarchist, I don't know that I necessarily agree that it's going to work.
Right, but I could name many benefits,
people.
Nick. I could name many. I don't believe in anarchy.
There are many benefits to anarchy.
Many benefits. I think that the benefits of a small, limited government are actually outweighed by those anarchist governments. And so that's what it is. It's a weighing system of how much do we need to suppress these other bad people, and et cetera, et cetera. Does it mean that we're for this big government, that all these people are, oh, well, they've been bought out, they're no longer limited free thinkers out there? No, absolutely not. It just means that we're not viewing things as black and white. There's a little bit of gray there, too, and you need to weigh things
and you
out.
also, the other thing you have to, we live in the real world. We don't live in a philosophy class.
Right.
So just because you have a philosophy, it's good to use that as a guiding philosophy. I'm not saying don't adhere to your principles, but if your philosophy doesn't really seem to work in the real world, I mean, communism really looked good on paper. It kind of relied on the idea that, and people are not going to be offended that I'm comparing them to communists, but it looks good on paper because everyone's going to want to work together. That was one of the fundamental tenets. Eventually, everyone will want to work together, so you won't need a big oppressive state. Well, that doesn't seem to work in real life. So when there are things in your philosophy that don't work, you kind of need to find a way to make your philosophy work as well as it practically can in reality.
Right, and of course, I think while we're on the real world topic of what are we actually going to be achieving in our lifetime or for our kids or grandkids, honestly, what can that be? Is it anarchy in the United States? Well, only if things really hit the fan.
The government's probably more likely to
bring it down. Right, really, the only reason that there's going to be anarchy in our lifetimes here is if things get really, really bad. And I don't want to live in that world. So what I'm doing, I mean, let's be honest about it. People don't want it. It's a very small percentage. I mean, less than 10% believe in a limited small government like us. Right. Then it's a fringe group on top of that want to be anarchists. So, I mean, let's be honest and in the real world. All right, Nick, we do need to move on because we do still have news stories to talk to and annoy those anarchists and those big government people out there.
Hopefully we're not really trying to fight with the anarchists.
No, we're trying to annoy everybody a little bit.
We're going in the same direction, at least, as the anarchists.
Essentially, if you're being annoyed, at least something's probing at you and you might be thinking. Critical thinking, thinking outside the box. That's what this show is about. So let's jump right into it and let's talk about some of the stories that are big in the news. We always talk about slashing government and, well, they're actually talking about that now because, well, as these...
They're BSing about it is what they're doing.
But they're talking about it.
They're talking about it. It's in the mainstream. There's actual talk in the mainstream about cutting entitlement programs, raising the retirement age, closing bases overseas. But it doesn't seem like Americans are really ready to pull the trigger on the idea of, yeah, let's get rid of some of the government spending. People are apparently, they don't like taxes. Americans do not like taxes. Okay? I get that. No one really likes taxes. They don't like deficits. They don't like this enormous debt that's being piled on top of them, and depending on how old you are, well, even if you're very young, on top of your children and grandchildren.
Right, that actually will lead to higher taxes, and I think that a lot of people actually
And less
get that.
services eventually.
Anyone who's had a
Yeah.
credit card before knows that bigger interest rates on your credit card, bigger debts on your credit card eventually lead to larger monthly payments, which is essentially the government's form of deficit and taxes.
Well, and the welfare state collapses too. I mean,
Right.
that's if you look at an example like the Soviet Union or like any government where the funding has really dried up or the debt has gotten too burdensome and they've collapsed, you either see rampant inflation or a breaking of promises or both. So even people who worked for government, their pensions either don't buy much more than a candy bar, or their pensions aren't there. Services get shut down, or you're just not able to run services, things like Medicare, Medicaid, food assistance. When the stuff really hits the fan, the government just throws, the poor people are the first people it throws overboard. Getting into this here, it's an ABC, CNBC poll. Americans say that giant federal deficits trouble them, but they're reluctant to actually move forward with a budget-cutting drive that would hurt the programs they like. People always want to cut the programs they don't like. 47% said deficits should be reduced with spending cuts, even if new education, healthcare, and energy programs were eliminated. The way that was phrased, that's only 46% only support cutting new programs. Let's not put in place new programs. It doesn't really get into cutting existing programs or cutting them back. But 46% said those programs should grow even if deficits continue to expand. So there's no clear consensus that we should actually reduce the size of government at all, even as the deficit explodes at a rate that nobody says is sustainable.
No.
I mean, I think you could find people who self-describe themselves as socialist. They don't think that the new healthcare legislation went far enough. And if they know anything about economics, or just they have any kind of common sense at all, they can tell you that the United States government cannot continue to spend in this way without dramatically raising taxes.
And actually cutting services. I mean, unless you're putting everyone's tax bracket at like 90% across the board.
If you really want to fix this problem, you have to drastically cut back services, which people don't like.
Right.
They mention here that Americans are too reluctant to take the pain.
Mm-hmm. Well, it hurts.
Do you want to pay higher taxes and get even less for it than you do now?
But it's going to happen eventually, and the longer we wait, Nick, the worse it's going to get. And we've been saying this. We've been saying this for many years, but finally, the big media. I mean, look at us. We've been doing this show for years, and we're still very young people. Young people. People say, who are those people to be talking about these issues? They don't know anything. Go back in our archives, threemindstv.com. Check out our archives. We've been saying this from year one, from episode 1 of the show, that we need to cut back on government, or else it's going to become more and more painful over the years, because eventually we will have to raise taxes while cutting back on services. And finally, even the big government folks out there are saying the same thing. The problem is, I don't think we're going to be coming to a solution here, because nobody wants their particular service cut. And as we were talking about, there are positive aspects of democracy. A lot of the negative ones grow a behemoth government this size, because part of democracy means everybody has their say in their programs. So everybody gets a little bit of their program, and then everybody comes together, and suddenly we have a million programs with costing millions and billions and trillions of dollars to get us into this hole. So that's one of the major drawbacks of democracy that may be outweighing some of these benefits, is everybody gets a voice, so everybody wants a big chunk of the pie.
Democracies bankrupt themselves pretty quickly.
Yes.
And I forget the economist who put it together. There was a book called Democracy, the God That Failed, actually pointing out that at least in economic terms, it seemed like monarchies, hereditary monarchies, had a better track record of not bankrupting themselves, because politicians in America, they want to get reelected for next term, so they don't care what happens to the budget 20 years down the line or 100 years down the line. Whereas monarchies, well, their family's presumably going to be running the country for a long time.
Right. They want their name to be in history for...
They want to keep it healthy enough to suck more blood out of it.
Right, and then have their name go down in history for hundreds of years, and their family lineage.
Emperors. I did want to point out really quickly, because we do have to move on, that there is some consensus, at least at this moment. The next poll in 2 weeks might show something different. But according to this poll, offered more than a dozen tax increases and spending cuts that were programs to help balance the budget, only 4 got a clear majority of support. That's more than 50%. Trim the federal workforce, cut their salaries, that is the federal workforce, close some overseas military bases, and ending the tax deduction for mortgage payments.
That tax deduction on mortgage payments, I'm just a little bit curious about what that would do for a lot of people out there.
They say they would do that and then cut overall tax rates.
Maybe that's just because people don't understand what that one means. I mean, yes, it's one of those ones that hurts, but I mean, they're all going to hurt somewhere. But with the mortgage crisis the way it's already going,
I honestly don't think the programs are all that helpful.
Oh,
I don't think
well,
closing
I think
overseas
they could be better.
bases are going to make.
And I think that this is, yes, one of the ones we're going to have to do. It is interesting how these poll numbers change and fluctuate, and it will be interesting to see what the American public thinks in a couple of weeks. But the point is, it's always going to hurt you if it's your program, if it's the one you rely on, your little baby. But the problem is, everybody's got a little baby, Nick.
Just about everybody gets money from the government these days.
In some way, some manner, some form, some shape. I don't care what kind of a job you have out there. I don't care if it's working for yourself.
Your industry probably benefits from government contracts,
Absolutely.
at least indirectly. So.
I mean, and if you're someone out there that's making their living preaching against the government, well, guess what? If it wasn't for the government, you wouldn't be making a living at it. So, I mean, everybody in some form has their little baby. So when everybody's got their baby and no one wants to crush the little baby federal government program here, well, then it's tough to cut any of them.
I don't know if we should compare cutting deficits to crushing babies. I don't think it's a pretty picture that works in our favor.
All right. Good point. Good point.
I do want to move on, though, because there's a story here coming out of Idaho that points out one way that you really should not try to skimp on government spending. And that's privatize, at least in my book. Now, again, there are a lot of people who advocate a stateless society out there who would argue that the government should run things like policing and courts and prisons and the military. I don't really agree, but even if you're going to make that case, you're probably not saying that the private market should run those things while there's still a government around. Do you want
not only that, but the government footing the bill for these programs?
Do you want the government in charge of making things
Right.
illegal and arresting people, but only letting the prisons?
You're a private
letting
police
private
force.
people run the prisons.
It means you get to decide how things are going to go, and then don't worry about it. We'll sign the checkbooks. We'll give you the salary. We'll provide the facility. We'll fund the whole thing.
This is privatization.
Right. So that's not really privatization. I mean,
Not really.
I think there are a lot of things in government that could be privatized. But it's a different meaning for what privatization it means.
Well, if it's funded by a good rule of thumb is if it's funded by taxpayer dollars in the end, it's not private. Right. So just because you're privatizing the profits for these corporations, you're socializing the cost. It's still a government funded program. There are many privately run prisons in the United States. They're publicly funded. Your tax money pays for it. It also pays for the profits for these corporations that run the prisons. Didn't think government was supposed to be a for-profit thing. This coming from the byline here is Boise, Idaho. The surveillance video from overhead cameras shows Hani Elabed being beaten by a fellow inmate in an Idaho prison, managing to bang on a prison guard station window, pleading for help. Behind the glass, correctional officers look on, but no one intervenes when Elabed is knocked unconscious. Furthermore, they don't intervene when the attacker sits down to rest and then resumes the beating. So the guy beats him for so long that he gets tired, literally sits down, and then starts beating the guy again.
Seems like, say you're a guard that's intimidated, I don't want to get in the middle of this and get hurt. Well, that's good. When the guy's taking a break because he's winded from beating the crap out of his cellmate.
You're a prison guard.
That's time to go in there.
If you don't want to have to break up prison fights, don't become a prison guard. And you might say, well, who cares about the prisoners? I don't know what this guy is in for. Oh. Maybe he's a horrible person. Maybe he's a child molester. Maybe he's a murderer. They really don't get into it.
Oh, if he's such a bad person, we should just kill him, not worry about paying to lock him up, right?
Yeah. Maybe he just has a drug habit. You don't know.
I'm being facetious, of course.
Now, the allegation here, how does this relate to privatization? Well, the allegation here is this is a privately run prison. It's not run by the state of Idaho. It's not run by the federal government. It's run by a company called the Corrections Corporation of America, which apparently oversees some 75,000 inmates in more than 60 facilities under contracts with the federal government, 19 states, and D.C. So you have a private company running prisons. The allegation is that they just let the inmates beat the crap out of each other in order to maintain control. If there's somebody they have trouble controlling, they just let the other inmates pound the crap out of them.
And it helps, I think, some of the stories like this I've been looking over, some of the allegations are that it actually will help prisoners snitch on their cellmates, for example, because then they got an in with the guard, and then that's kind of protectionism. So if you want to be protected by the guards, the allegation is, well, you better be a model prisoner and snitch on your cellmates and get yourself possibly in some trouble in that prison with other inmates in order to be protected by the guards. That seems like cruel and unusual punishment and a direct violation of the Constitution if you're going to be locking people up for whatever crime and then subjecting them to beatings.
Right. Well, and there are allegations that after the beatings like this occur, the company in charge of running this is also denying medical treatment as a way of covering it up.
Yeah.
Well, you also don't want records saying, yeah, we have hundreds of beatings every year at our prison.
Well, this one got...
prisons, I mean, they can be very violent places, but in reality, a well-run prison, it's not like the reality, like the TV series that you see on HBO. People aren't always shivving each other and
and if it's the better that you
other.
run the prison, the fewer guards you need, and actually the happier the prisoners are, the healthier the prisoners are, the better chance they have to go back into society and not get arrested again.
Right, and well, the other concern here is that when you put a profit motive into having a large prison population, it incentivizes, at least there's a lobby out here. I'm not saying they're very strong, because I don't think they are. I think there are other reasons for the U.S. having the largest prison population in the world, which it does. But it gives this group of companies, the ones who run the prisons, it gives them an incentive to keep masses of Americans getting locked up. They want to see more people flowing into the prison population.
More people, more profit.
You want to see your market grow. If your business is incarcerating people, you want double the number of Americans in prison.
Yep.
And I think it's very dangerous when you put in place private companies that are interested in seeing the government enact more laws. Because remember, these companies don't just have to lobby about things that relate to prisons. Different companies can lobby about any kind of legislation they want if they feel it affects their business. So I'm not saying that's going on now, but I think I wouldn't be surprised if you do see, I don't know if these groups have lobbyists or not, but I certainly think if this continues to be a trend where you see correctional facilities being privatized, I think you're going to see more lobbying for things like mandatory minimum sentencing on drug laws and other things that serve no public good.
Oh, right.
They just throw more people in
So
jail
the
cells.
goal would not only be to increase the prisoner population, but also retain those prisoners as well.
Right.
Make sure
long sentences,
Right.
high recidivism rates.
Yep. You're not going to want to really rehabilitate them. You want them to come back next week.
I'm not saying that's what these companies have done.
But that's
anything
the
to encourage
incentive,
that.
Nick.
But that is the economic incentive.
Right.
That's just good business.
And let's face it, people are driven by incentives, whether they know it or not. So, I mean, policy is driven by incentives.
If you're good at
Everything we
business, you
do.
usually know it too.
Right. And even if we don't know it, Nick, there
just
are
lucky.
implicit and explicit incentives that drive our every behavior. And let's not just pretend that everybody has a clear-cut moral purview here and knows what they're doing. I mean, in all honesty, talking about incentives, they might not always be explicit, implicit. We might not always know what we're acting on. We're human beings. We're all human beings. And the ones who are implementing these policies aren't necessarily the smartest ones out there. I do want to move on, though, Nick. We have got another story I wanted to touch on here because, well, it's disturbing to me. We've been talking about the TSA, the naked screening, the walking through the backscatter machine, and as well as some of the radiation that could happen from that, possibly, I don't know, or the invasive pat-down procedures where they grope you and touch you and molest you to make sure that you're not a terrorist and all. We've been talking about that both on the TV show and the radio show, as most of the media out there. It's starting to die down, as we talked about. America pretty much gave up. There's a big talk. People don't like it, or about half of them don't like it, but they're willing to put up with it as long as they get to go where they have to go. Let's face it, we're all busy people, and if we need to get on an airplane and walking through a naked body scanner machine or getting groped by some weird TSA person gets us on that plane, most of us are going to do it. About actually half of us are going to like it. That's what the poll numbers show, at least. Anyways, one thing that I found very disturbing, well, we talked about last week how the American people are swallowing it. I do find that as disturbing. Another really disturbing factor here is we may have been put on a list simply for talking about it because we were advocating, or at least implicitly advocating, I'm not sure exactly what we say, against these things. Well, actually, we were explicitly advocating against them. I'm not sure if we actually told people to...
I think we said, I don't think we said, go do this. I think we said, I would like to see people opt out.
Well, I think that would count, Nick. We are now on a list for that. Or at least we should be on a list for that. This coming from Doug Hoffman. Apparently, a DHS memo leaked from from DHS that was for the White House administration, the Obama administration. The memo, which actually takes the form of administrative directive, appears that, let's see here, any person, group, or alternative media source that actively objects to, causes others object to, supports or elicits support for anyone who engages in such travel disruptions at U.S. airports in response to enhanced security procedures shall be, quote, a domestic extremist. And, okay, so we're not only domestic extremists on that, but any person, group, or domestic alternative media source that actively objects, blah, 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 to this should be put on this list, and applicable DHS administrators should be instructed to identify and to collect information about the persons, entities, and submit that information in a manner as outlined within the memo. So essentially collecting, spying, data collection on us, making another terrorist list.
I think if you're like us, you might assume that you already have an FBI file.
Why are we extreme for saying that it's crazy to expect to be going through this machine that takes naked pictures of you or get groped in the crotch region before getting on an airplane? That's an extreme view now, Nick?
Well,
that's enough to put you on a list?
It's better to call your political opponents, people who oppose your government or your system of government, it's better to label them as extremists, terrorists, any other kind of nasty term you can come up with. Criminals, it was a popular one in many countries. But you're not going to say, people with differing viewpoints, or they're pretty reasonable people who disagree with us list. You're going to call people extremists and try to marginalize them.
Domestic extremists kind of goes right along with domestic terrorists, Nick.
Right.
It's not that far away.
To me, it seems like more of an extreme departure from the idea of a constitutional night watchman state to say that we should have this big government. That if you say you think that people should opt out of going through naked body scanners and bowing down to the federal government, that you should be put on a watch list. It's kind of weird, actually, that we have basically secret police forces in the United States when you think about it.
I'd say it's crazy,
They put you on lists, because a lot of Americans think they might be on a list somewhere.
Seems like an extreme form of government. Anyways, I guess we're on another list for that. More data points for those federal DHS
We'll be talking about WikiLeaks next week. That'll put us on a list.
Whew. Anyways, we're out of time, though.
They get killed.
I just want to live my life, Nick, without too much trouble from those governments.
Talking about WikiLeaks, I think it's a big story.
Anyways, join us online, freemindsmedia.org. Until next week, it has been Toby here with you.
And Nick.
And we'll be back next week with an all-new episode of Free Minds TV, as well as this Sunday with a Free Minds Radio. Have a good night.
Like